Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. Today's story is about Soviet officials whose deaths never felt fully settled. Not every one of these deaths can be called murder. In some cases, the official cause was a shooting, an operation, a crash, or a suicide. But in each case, the explanation left behind unanswered questions. That happened for one simple reason. The Soviet system was built on controlled information. When powerful people died suddenly, the public rarely received a version of events that inspired complete trust. And once trust is gone, even an official explanation can feel incomplete for decades. One of the earliest examples is Mikhail Frunze, one of the most important military figures of the early Soviet state. Britannica records that Frunze, one of the fathers of the Red Army, died in Moscow on October 31, 1925, after rising to the top of the Soviet military hierarchy. The basic fact is clear. He died during or after surgery. What made the case mysterious was the suspicion that grew around it almost immediately. Britannica also notes that Boris Pilniak's The Tale of the Unextinguished Moon was a scarcely veiled literary account of Frunze's death during an operation, and that the magazine issue containing it was withdrawn at once. That detail matters because it shows that people close to Soviet political life already sensed that Frunze's death was not seen as an ordinary medical event. The mystery around Frunze has lasted because the case sits right on the line between medicine and power. We know he died after a surgical decision. We also know his death was politically sensitive enough to inspire almost instant literary allegory and equally instant censorship. That does not prove assassination. It does prove that the Soviet state wanted tight control over how the death could be discussed. In a system like that, suspicion grows naturally. If a powerful military figure dies unexpectedly and even indirect public discussion is suppressed, the result is not clarity. It is permanent doubt. The most consequential example is Sergei Kirov, murdered in 1934. Britannica notes that Kirov's assassination was a turning point that helped trigger the Great Purge. The shooter, Leonid Nikolaev, was caught immediately. So in a narrow legal sense, this was never a whodunit. But another Britannica source says it is commonly thought Stalin was behind the assassination, partly because Kirov was popular enough to be considered a rival. And Britannica's broader history of the Soviet Union goes even further, saying Kirov's access had been arranged by senior local NKVD officials, and that there is little doubt Stalin sponsored the murder through Genrikh Yagoda. That is why Kirov belongs in this story. The gunman was known. The deeper truth behind the killing never became historically simple. What makes Kirov's death so mysterious is not lack of significance, but too much significance. The murder was instantly useful to Stalin. It became the pretext for decrees on summary trials, arrests, and the expanding campaign that turned into the Great Purge. Once a death becomes politically useful on that scale, every official explanation becomes harder to trust. The Soviet state did not investigate Kirov's murder in a neutral environment. It investigated it while building an entire architecture of repression on top of it. That means the case was never just about who fired the shot. It was about who benefited, who arranged access, and how much the system already knew. Another death that became impossible to separate from politics was that of Andrei Zhdanov. Britannica records that Zhdanov died in Moscow on August 31, 1948, and specifically says his death is shrouded in mystery. The same source notes that his sudden death was followed by the Leningrad affair, a sweeping purge that destroyed many of his associates and followers. Britannica's article on the doctor's plot adds another layer. In 1953, the Soviet press publicly accused Kremlin doctors of poisoning Zhdanov and other leaders, only for those charges to be exposed after Stalin's death as fabricated and baseless. So Zhdanov's death ended up trapped inside at least three overlapping stories: serious illness, factional struggle, and a later false accusation of medical murder. That is what makes the Zhdanov case so revealing. The Soviet state itself produced mutually incompatible explanations. First, there was the medical death. Then, there was the politically charged allegation that doctors had deliberately caused it. Then came the post-Stalin reversal, admitting the doctors had been falsely accused. In a transparent system, that kind of contradiction would trigger a credible reopening of the case. In Stalin's system, it created permanent ambiguity. Historians can see the political struggle around Zhdanov's death very clearly. What they cannot do, with complete certainty, is separate the real medical truth from the political uses to which the death was later put. By the late Soviet period, official deaths had taken on a different kind of mystery. One important example is Pyotr Masharov, the longtime leader of Soviet Byelorussia. The Washington Post reported in October 1980 that Masharov died in an auto accident and noted that TASS, the official Soviet news agency, announced his death without giving details of the accident. The same report emphasized that Masharov had long been tipped as a possible successor to Premier Alexei Kosygin. Those two facts explain why the case never quite settled in public memory. A high-ranking figure with real political weight died suddenly, and the official announcement gave almost no detail. Even if the crash was exactly what the authorities said it was, the combination of his stature and the thinness of the public explanation guaranteed suspicion. The final and most concentrated cluster of mysterious deaths came during the collapse of the Soviet Union in August 1991. Britannica's account of the failed coup states that after Gorbachev returned to Moscow, Interior Minister Boris Pugo shot his wife, though not fatally, and then killed himself. Britannica also says that Marshal Sergei Akromiev later hanged himself, that Nikolai Khrushchev, the Communist Party's administrator of affairs, also committed suicide, and that rumors circulated these deaths were actually murders carried out in retribution. Contemporary UPI and Washington Post reporting on Akromiev's death described him as being found dead in his Moscow office, with officials calling it suicide. These were the final days of the Soviet system, and that matters. By then, public trust had eroded so badly that even official explanations of death could not easily command belief. This is where the overlap between politics, secrecy, and suspicion becomes clearest. Pugo, Akromiev, and Khrushchev were not obscure figures. They were senior insiders standing at the edge of a collapsing state. Their deaths came in the immediate aftermath of the failed coup, when power, fear, and retaliation were all in the air. Britannica does not say those rumors were true. It says they circulated. That distinction matters. A fact-based reading of these deaths must keep the line between confirmed event and later suspicion absolutely clear. But the suspicions themselves are historically important, because they show how little confidence remained in official narratives by the very end of the Soviet era. Taken together, these cases show several types of Soviet mystery. Frunze's death was a medical event almost immediately shadowed by censorship and rumor. Kirov's was a political assassination with a known gunman, but an unresolved question of higher responsibility. Zhdanov's death was swallowed by factional struggle and later by a fabricated poisoning case. Masharov's fatal crash remained colored by his political significance and the thinness of the public account. And the deaths of Pugo, Akromiev, and Khrushchev became symbols of a state so weakened that even official suicides could not escape speculation. Different decades, different causes, but the same underlying pattern. In a system built on secrecy, explanation was never enough on its own. That is why the most mysterious deaths of Soviet officials still matter today. They are not remembered only because powerful people died. They are remembered because each case reveals the same problem. When information is tightly controlled, suspicion grows faster than trust. The Soviet Union could announce a cause of death, close a file, or punish the wrong people, but it could not force later generations to believe that the whole truth had been told. And once that happens, every sudden death at the top of the system leaves behind two stories: the official one and the one history keeps asking about. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.